Well, welcome, Marina, again to our third edition of ACLU on the Hill. Thanks for being here. Are you counting how many days we have left, or how many? Are we almost at the halfway point?
Yeah, we're getting close. If this is our third episode, that means there are just 4 more to go.
You know, that's a good way to keep track of it. All right. So there's been a lot of activity on the Hill this week. We're actually recording this on Thursday, so still some time for things to happen, but it's already been a busy week. Can you tell us about a bill, HB 57, that ACLU has been supporting and working on for a long time? It finally made out of committee this week.
Yeah, it did, rather quickly, actually. This is what happens when you have a really controversial bill. Lots of opposition, lots of concerns. The bill is held. All the stakeholders spend a week and a half or so working to fix those concerns and work on amendments that are amenable and agreeable to everybody around the table. Then you bring it back before the committee, and there's virtually no opposition, and the bill passes. I actually had a colleague say to me, "Wow, I thought that bill was controversial. It passed so quickly." It's like, well, trust me, it was controversial. There were lots of meetings, lots of hours of negotiation that went into getting that easy vote in committee the second time the bill came around. But that's what we achieved in the end. I think a really good balance. And the bill provides for some really meaningful protections for the data that we hold in sort of this virtual way when it's held by a third-party provider.
And that's a bill that I think everyday Utahns can understand, because we all have our computers and our hard disks and our phones, but a lot of us also store things on the cloud. And this bill takes some of those protections and extends them to third-party servers and data storage. Is that right?
That's right. And requires a warrant whenever law enforcement wants to access that information from a third-party provider.
Okay. Now, there was another bill that we've been working behind, and that is HB 244. It's a little complicated, but also a really good bill in putting Utah in a good place in terms of how it does its criminal justice. Can you describe that bill first, because it might be new for some of our viewers, and then tell us what might happen with it in the future?
Yeah, so there's this interesting sort of glitch and overlap between the way that federal immigration law works and state criminal law works. And the problem that arises is federal immigration law allows for automatic deportation of legal immigrants, so we're talking about folks with a green card, refugees, those sorts of folks, if they commit what the federal government defines as an aggravated felony. So obviously, aggravated felony, you can guess that the intent there was very serious crimes. Unfortunately, because each state defines their felonies differently, the federal government just said aggravated felony means any crime which carries a potential sentence of 365 days or more. That 365 is important, remember that. The reason it's important is because Utah defines misdemeanors, which are relatively minor offenses usually, as being any crime which carries a sentence up to and including 365 days. So therein lies the problem. You have this one-day overlap where a relatively minor crime, shoplifting for example, could carry a potential sentence of up to 365 days, thus triggering automatic deportation under federal immigration law. So what the bill does, relatively simple bill, it makes just a few little word changes. It reclassifies misdemeanors in the state of Utah as now carrying a potential sentence of only 364 days, thus making clear that misdemeanors are sentences that go up to 364 days. Felonies start at 365 days, and thus sort of avoiding this problem of negative interaction between state and federal law.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned it's a potential sentence. So these are sentences that, for minor crimes, that might only be a couple weeks in jail, but if it's a potential sentence up to 365 days, that's still triggered right now, and that's something we're trying to fix. Is that right?
That is right, yes.
What happens if you commit a crime in a leap year? Does that change at all?
It's a very good question. Well, now it won't be a problem if we get this bill passed and things are bumped down to 364 days. So
that's great. That's a really good bill. It's a bill that will have a lot of impact, and it's something that we're working to explain and get out there so that people know that it is really just helping keeping families together here in Utah. There was also big news, actually, just today on Thursday about a bill that sort of rose early in the session, faded away, but then came back this week with a committee hearing scheduled for this afternoon. That is, refresh my memory, I believe it's HB 153, the sort of vital statistics, or what we would call the birth certificate bill, that would have prevented people who are transgender from changing their birth certificates in Utah. There's been a lot of action on that bill. Can you describe what has happened and where we are now?
Yeah, so the bill, I think was really born out of some discussions that were happening last year, last legislative session, and over the interim around whether the legislature should be providing guidance to judges about how to determine petitions that come before them to change your birth certificate, and specifically to change the question of your gender on your birth certificate. Senator Todd Weiler took a different approach last legislative session, wanting to tell judges specifically what they needed to find in order to grant these sorts of petitions. While he was debating this bill, Representative Nelson was on the committee that was hearing it, and I think got an idea of a different approach. I think it was his direction in HB 153 to say that your sex is something that can never be changed on your birth certificate. That was the bill that originally came out in HB 153. He's then subsequently released some substitute language, which would have provided at least an option for people to change their driver's license.
Which would that have been new in Utah?
Yes, and that would have actually in some ways been very helpful. Most people do use their driver's license for a lot of identification purposes, and the alternative language he provided would have avoided having to go to court in order to make that sort of change. So that was definitely a benefit. Unfortunately, it sort of came at a really high price, probably too high a price, in that it was accompanied by language that said you could never change your birth certificate at all. Which not only was problematic, I think, for us policy-wise for the transgender community, but also raises some pretty serious legal concerns. There are some court cases at the district court level in a couple of states that have declared that sort of policy to be unconstitutional. So
it looks like we've got a truce declared for this legislative session. The bill is not coming back. But what lies ahead for this issue? It doesn't seem like we've resolved it.
Yeah, so, we're really grateful, I think, to Representative Nelson and to leadership in the legislature recognizing that there were some real concerns with this particular approach. But I think you're right. I think the story is not over. There's a pending Supreme Court case here in Utah on this very question. As you know, Senator Weiler still has, some bill language. It hasn't come out this session, but there's certainly that approach before the legislature. There's now been floated Representative Merrill Nelson's approach, and I think the conversation will continue in the months following the legislative session.
So into the summer, into the rest of the year. Okay, and potentially maybe something next year. Okay. All right, well, thank you, Marina, for joining us today. We've got a lot more issues still to come, and probably, 4 or 5 episodes to go, something like that. I appreciate your time and your expertise, so thank you.
Sure, see you next week.